Even Jay Leno couldn't love these disasters. From bizarre designs to total engineering flops, these 12 stupidest cars of all time are so bad, even hardcore car lovers struggle to defend them. You've never seen anything like this. I still remember the first time I laid eyes on my 1958 Edsel Corsair. It sat at the far end of a classic car lot, neglected and unwanted. Its chrome dulled by time, its paint faded and worn. People walked by it with a chuckle, some shaking their heads, others pointing and murmuring about how it was one of the biggest failures in automotive history. But to me, it wasn't just a car, it was a symbol. A grand, misguided, and wonderfully excessive attempt at something greater. And despite all of its faults, I had to have it. The salesman barely tried to sell it to me. "You sure you want this one, ye?" he asked with an arched brow, as if I had just asked to purchase a haunted house. He explained how difficult it was to find parts, how everyone would laugh at me, how it wasn't really collectible in the way a Cadillac or even a well-preserved Ford Fairlane was. I didn't care. I had already fallen for its absurdity. I handed him the money, signed the paperwork, and took possession of one of the most infamous cars in American history. Sitting behind the wheel for the first time, I felt like I had been transported back to the late 1950s, when bigger was always better, chrome was king, and the future looked like a jet-age dream. The Corsair's interior was a monument to mid-century excess. Thick, cushy bench seats that felt like a living room sofa, a dashboard gleaming with chrome, and an instrument cluster that was designed to make the driver feel like they were piloting a spaceship rather than a land yacht. The push-button transmission was located in the center of the steering wheel, an idea that must have seemed futuristic at the time but ended up confusing and frustrating drivers. The first time I started it up, the big 410 cubic inch V8 coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a low, throaty grumble. It had been sitting for years, neglected and unloved, but after a bit of coaxing, it found its voice again. I eased it into gear, and the car lurched forward like a waking giant. Driving an Edsel is unlike driving any other classic car. You don't simply steer it, you command it, like a captain at the helm of an ocean liner. The suspension is so soft that you feel like you're floating down the road, and the body leans dramatically into every turn, as if the car itself is protesting the idea of changing direction. The steering has a vague, disconnected feel, as though you're just making suggestions rather than actually controlling the car. It's not fast despite its powerful V8, because it weighs nearly 4,500 pounds and was designed more for effortless cruising than for any sort of spirited driving. But the experience is unforgettable. One of the first things you realize when driving an Edsel is that people will notice you. Not in the way they notice a Ferrari or a Corvette, but with a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and sometimes outright disbelief. At nearly every stoplight, someone will roll down their window and shout, "Is that an Edsel?" Some will laugh, some will shake their heads, some will ask why on earth I bought one. And every once in a while, an older gentleman will approach me at a gas station, eyes filled with nostalgia, and tell me a story about how his father owned one, or how he remembers the disastrous launch back in '57. Ah, yes, the launch. Ford had poured millions into the Edsel brand, convinced that it would be the next big thing. The marketing campaign was extravagant, with months of hype leading up to its grand reveal. But when the covers were pulled off, the public's reaction was lukewarm at best, hostile at worst. The car's distinctive vertical grille, meant to stand out, was widely mocked. Some said it looked like a toilet seat. Others compared it to an Oldsmobile sucking on a lemon. The push-button transmission proved to be a nightmare for mechanics, and the pricing didn't make sense. Too expensive to compete with Ford's more affordable models, yet not prestigious enough to justify its price against Lincoln or Cadillac. The Edsel name became synonymous with failure almost overnight. The brand lasted just 3 years before Ford pulled the plug, leaving behind a mess of unsold inventory and a reputation that would haunt the company for decades. And yet, despite all of this, I love my Edsel. It is in many ways a rolling monument to failed ambition. It represents an era when automakers dreamed big, took risks, and occasionally fell flat on their faces. It's a reminder that not every bold idea succeeds, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth attempting. Every time I slide behind the wheel, fire up that old V8 and take it out for a drive, I can't help but smile. Yes, people laugh. Yes, it's impractical. Yes, it guzzles gas like there's no tomorrow. But it's mine. And as I float down the highway in my big, brash, ill-fated beauty, I feel a connection to the past that no modern car could ever replicate. Some cars are remembered for their triumphs. I still remember the day I bought my 1971 Ford Pinto. People laughed, they shook their heads. Some even gave me a look like I had just willingly volunteered to jump into a burning building. "Are you out of your mind?" one friend asked. "You do know that thing's famous for exploding, right?" Oh, I knew. Everyone knew. The Pinto had become one of the most infamous cars in American history, not because it was particularly awful to drive, or because it was ugly, or even because it was unreliable. No, the Pinto earned its place in automotive infamy for something far worse. It had an unfortunate tendency to turn into a fireball if you so much as sneezed on its rear bumper too hard. And Ford, rather than fixing the issue, had simply shrugged and said, it's cheaper to pay out lawsuits. But here's the thing, I was fascinated by that history. To me, the Pinto wasn't just a car. It was a piece of living, rolling scandal. A perfect example of what happens when a company prioritizes cost-cutting over common sense. I wanted to own one, not because it was good, but because it was notorious. The one I found was sitting on the lot of a small used car dealership, squeezed between an old Dodge Dart and a rusty Chevrolet Vega. It was red with faded black vinyl seats, a cracked dashboard, and an odometer that had probably rolled over at least once. I opened the door and climbed inside, getting a whiff of that unmistakable scent of aged vinyl, sun-baked plastic, and decades-old cigarette smoke. The seats were firm, the steering wheel was thin, and the gear shifter had just enough play in it to make me wonder if it was actually connected to anything. I turned the key, and the little four-cylinder engine coughed to life with all the enthusiasm of an asthmatic squirrel. It rattled, it buzzed, and it idled with the kind of uneven rhythm that suggested it was making a conscious effort to hold itself together. The car weighed barely 2,000 pounds, but with the underpowered engine and automatic transmission, it felt like it took every ounce of energy just to get moving. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the real problem, the one that gave the Pinto its infamous reputation, was sitting right behind me. The gas tank. Ford, in its rush to create a cheap, lightweight, fuel-efficient Triumph, had placed the gas tank in the absolute worst possible location, right behind the rear axle with virtually no protection. In the event of a rear-end collision, the thin metal of the tank could crumple like a soda can, rupture, and spray gasoline everywhere. And if that gasoline happened to find its way to the car's hot exhaust or an exposed battery terminal, instant fireball. But here's where the story gets even crazier. Ford knew about this problem before the car even hit the market. Their own engineers had warned them, saying the design was dangerous. They even came up with fixes: stronger reinforcements, a rubber bladder for the tank, a simple plastic shield. Each of these solutions would have cost about $5 per car. But instead of fixing it, Ford ran a cost-benefit analysis and determined that paying out wrongful death lawsuits would be cheaper than recalling and repairing the vehicles. Think about that. Somewhere in a Ford office, some accountant sat down, crunched the numbers, and decided that a human life was worth less than a $5 piece of plastic. And so, the Pinto went to market. It sold well at first, small cheap cars were in demand, and the Pinto fit the bill. But as reports of fiery crashes started making the news, the car's reputation went up in flames, sometimes literally. Investigative journalists exposed Ford's cost-cutting decision, lawsuits piled up, and the scandal became one of the biggest corporate ethics disasters in automotive history. Eventually, the government stepped in, and Ford was forced to recall 1.5 million Pintos. But by then, the damage had been done. The Pinto was a joke, a rolling punchline, a symbol of everything wrong with corporate greed. So why on earth did I buy one? Maybe I have a soft spot for underdogs. Maybe I just love weird automotive history. Or maybe I like the idea of owning something so absurdly notorious. Either way, I found myself driving it home, cautiously keeping an eye on the rearview mirror for any tailgaters. Driving a Pinto today is an experience in itself. It feels incredibly light, almost fragile, like it could be knocked over by a strong gust of wind. The steering is vague, the brakes are questionable, and the build quality is, well, let's just say that cost-effective was the highest priority. The little engine hums along with an optimistic buzz, but acceleration is leisurely at best. But the real fun is at gas stations and parking lots. People always stop and stare. Some shake their heads, others laugh. And then there are the ones who walk over with a knowing grin. "Is that a Pinto?" they ask, eyes wide with disbelief. The first time I laid eyes on a BMW Isetta, I thought someone was playing a joke on me. It looked like something out of a cartoon, like a car drawn by a child who had only seen real cars in passing. Tiny, round, and somehow both futuristic and ancient at the same time, the Isetta didn't just look strange, it felt completely out of place on the road. It was as if someone had accidentally put a golf cart in the traffic and expected it to keep up with real cars. But no, this was a real road-legal vehicle, and for some reason I was about to become its owner. Buying an Isetta isn't like buying a normal car. You don't just slide into the driver's seat and start it up. No, you have to climb in through the front. The entire front of the car, windshield, steering wheel, dashboard and all, swings outward like the door of a refrigerator. That's right, you enter the car by opening up what is essentially its entire face. At first, this seems like an interesting quirk, a bit of clever engineering to save space. And then you realize the massive flaw in this design. If you park too close to anything, a wall, another car, even a curb, you're trapped. The only way out is through the sunroof, if you're lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, you're just stuck, sitting inside your little automotive fishbowl, waiting for someone to push you away from the obstruction so you can escape. But let's talk about the experience of actually driving an Isetta, because that's where things really go off the rails. Under the rear hatch sits a motorcycle engine. Not just a small car engine, a literal single-cylinder, 98cc engine borrowed from a BMW motorcycle. It produces a breathtaking 13 horsepower. To put that into perspective, most modern riding lawnmowers have more power than this car. A strong gust of wind can slow you down. Hills? Forget about it. Even a slight incline turns into an uphill battle, requiring you to downshift and pray that gravity takes pity on you. Top speed? Officially, it's around 50 miles per hour, but good luck ever reaching that. If you're driving alone, with an empty fuel tank, a well-lubricated drivetrain, and a tailwind, you might see 45. If you have a passenger, your chances of breaking 40 are slim. Load up the tiny trunk with groceries, and you'll be lucky to keep up with a jogger. And then there's the handling, or lack thereof. With its narrow stance, 3 or sometimes 4 wheels, and laughably soft suspension, the Isetta isn't so much driven as it is guided gently in the general direction you'd like to go. Sharp corners are a no-go. Hard braking? Best of luck. This car wasn't designed with modern traffic in mind. And speaking of braking, don't expect to stop quickly. With tiny drum brakes that feel more like they're suggesting you slow down rather than actually enforcing it, every red light is an adventure. Despite all of this, driving an Isetta is fun. Not in the way a sports car is fun, not because it's fast or capable or thrilling, but because it's hilarious. You'll never drive an Isetta without someone stopping to ask about it. People smile, wave, and take pictures. They ask, "What is that thing? Does it actually run? Are you sure it's not a toy?" Children think it's the funniest thing they've ever seen. Even hardened car enthusiasts, the ones who normally scoff at anything under 300 horsepower, will stop and marvel at the absurdity of this little rolling egg. Even Jay Leno, who owns an Isetta himself, admits that it's comically bad and so slow that you're better off walking. But he still loves it because the Isetta represents something rare in the automotive world. A moment when car makers, struggling in the post-war economy, threw every conventional idea out the window and tried something completely new. It was tiny, it was impractical, and it was underpowered, but it was different. So, is the BMW Isetta a good car? Absolutely not. It's slow, impractical, and dangerous in modern traffic. But is it charming? Unquestionably. It's a rolling piece of automotive history, a symbol of an era when innovation meant taking risks, even if those risks resulted in a car that could barely outrun a bicycle. And if you ever get the chance to drive one, I highly recommend it. Just don't park too close to a wall. The 1982 Cadillac Cimarron has gone down in automotive history as one of the most controversial and miscalculated decisions ever made by a luxury brand. In an era when luxury car brands like BMW and Mercedes were introducing more compact, high-end offerings to appeal to a younger, more budget-conscious demographic, Cadillac thought it could replicate their success by doing the same. But it went terribly wrong. The result was the Cimarron, a car that was meant to represent Cadillac's entry into the compact luxury market, but instead became a prime example of how to destroy a brand's reputation in the blink of an eye. At its core, the Cimarron was essentially a rebadged Chevrolet Cavalier. Cadillac took a car that was known for being cheap and basic, added some superficial luxury touches like leather seats, faux wood trim, and a few features to make it feel upscale, and then slapped a Cadillac badge on it. The idea was that by offering a cheaper alternative to their traditional luxury cars, Cadillac would attract a younger crowd who desired prestige but didn't have the budget for a full-size luxury sedan. But what Cadillac failed to realize was that they weren't just selling a car, they were selling a brand. The Cimarron wasn't just an entry-level car, it was a statement of the brand's values, or rather a complete contradiction to those values. When you think Cadillac, you think of sophistication, power, and performance. The Cimarron delivered none of these. It came with a humble 1.8-liter four-cylinder engine, producing just about 90 horsepower, making it one of the least powerful luxury cars on the market at the time. To put that in perspective, the Chevrolet Cavalier, the Cimarron's counterpart, had nearly identical specs. You could almost imagine Cadillac executives telling their buyers that luxury was in the interior, not the performance. But let's be real. When someone is purchasing a Cadillac, they expect more than just a plush interior. They expect a driving experience that mirrors the prestige of the nameplate. The Cimarron completely missed the mark, offering a slow, unrefined driving experience instead. Then there's the design. The Cimarron tried to carry over some of the design language Cadillac was known for: sharp lines, a sleek, angular shape, and bold detailing. But instead of exuding elegance and power, the Cimarron's design felt bland and uninspired, like a generic compact car that could have come from any manufacturer. Cadillac's designers had clearly been forced to work with limited resources, and the result was a car that just looked out of place next to the big luxury sedans Cadillac was known for. It simply didn't look like a car you'd expect to find with that iconic crest on the grille. But perhaps the most egregious offense of the Cimarron wasn't the performance, the design, or even the badge engineering. It was the price. Cadillac took a car that cost a fraction of its selling price to make and slapped an inflated luxury price tag on it. The Cimarron debuted with a base price of around $9,000. And while that might sound reasonable by today's standards, it was significantly more expensive than its Chevy counterpart. In fact, when you consider that the Chevrolet Cavalier could be had for much less, it was hard to justify why anyone would pay so much more for a car that offered little in return. Cadillac's decision to sell a rebadged economy car as a luxury vehicle was a slap in the face to customers who had come to expect excellence from the brand. Unfortunately, the Cimarron was not only poorly received by critics and consumers, but it also nearly destroyed Cadillac's reputation. In fact, Jay Leno, no stranger to oddball and quirky cars, has referred to the Cimarron as the car that nearly killed Cadillac. He points out how it represented the brand's attempt to dumb down its luxury image in order to compete in a market that didn't want a watered-down version of Cadillac. Instead of attracting the younger demographic Cadillac hoped to reach, the Cimarron was dismissed as a bad joke. It was clear to anyone who knew Cadillac's heritage that the Cimarron didn't belong in the same league as the brand's more refined and powerful vehicles. But the real tragedy here is that the Cimarron could have been a great car if Cadillac had taken a different approach. Instead of simply slapping a luxury badge on an inexpensive car, Cadillac could have invested in a genuine compact luxury vehicle, one that combined performance, style, and true luxury features. But Cadillac didn't take that path, and the Cimarron became a symbol of everything wrong with the brand in the 1980s. The mistake was simple. Cadillac forgot that it wasn't just selling a car, it was selling a lifestyle, a status symbol, and a promise of excellence. Ultimately, the Cimarron was discontinued after just a few years, and Cadillac learned the hard way that badge engineering doesn't work. The 1948 Davis Divan is one of those vehicles that's hard to comprehend, even by today's standards. Imagine a three-wheeled, four-seat convertible that looked like a UFO melted in the sun. That's essentially the Davis Divan in a nutshell. Built by a man named Gary Davis, who was more famous for his ability to take investors' money and disappear than for any engineering prowess, the Divan was the kind of car that could only exist in the world of strange, ill-fated automotive history. Davis, who fancied himself a visionary, promised that the Divan would revolutionize the automotive world with its quirky, three-wheel design and futuristic looks. The car was supposed to be the epitome of comfort and style. It even had some intriguing features, like a smooth, bubble-like body and a convertible top. But when it came to performance, practicality, and just about anything else, the Divan fell spectacularly short. The first glaring problem with the Davis Divan was its stability, or lack thereof. As a three-wheeled car, the Divan had all the stability of a shopping cart on a windy day. When driving, it was prone to tipping over, especially when navigating tight turns or uneven surfaces. While other cars of the time had four wheels to keep them planted on the road, the Davis Divan relied on just three. And unfortunately, that was about as unwise as it sounds. For a car that was meant to be a road-going vehicle, it was surprisingly impractical, more so than most concepts of the era. Performance wasn't any better. Despite having a 2.5-liter engine, the Davis Divan wasn't exactly a speed demon. It was slow, sluggish, and could barely make it up to highway speeds. To make matters worse, the car was built on the cheap. The body and materials weren't nearly as durable or refined as they should have been, which, combined with its already shaky performance, made it a disaster on wheels. But perhaps the most embarrassing aspect was its design. Although it was meant to be futuristic, the Davis Divan looked more like something an alien ship would produce after a crash landing. Its wide, bulbous body and oddly rounded shape made it look less like a sleek automobile and more like a mistake that had been left to fester in the sun. Even by the standards of the late 1940s, it was already outdated in concept, like someone had confused futuristic with ridiculous. Despite all its failings, the Davis Divan's biggest flaw wasn't even the car itself, but the man behind it, Gary Davis. Davis was a classic snake oil salesman who promised more than he could deliver. He somehow convinced investors to back the production of the Divan, despite the fact that there was no real market demand for such an impractical, weirdly designed car. Once he had their money, he went on to produce only a handful of cars before he disappeared, leaving investors in the lurch. In a classic case of fraud, he vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. The car's production was discontinued and only a few models were ever made. Interestingly enough, Jay Leno, who has built a reputation for his vast collection of unique and eccentric cars, actually owns one of these Davis Divans. He's gone on record calling it one of the strangest failures in automotive history. And that's saying something coming from Leno, a man who's no stranger to oddball and rare cars. He points out the car's oddness, but also its curious place in automotive lore, as it remains a reminder of what happens when bad ideas and poor execution collide. The Davis Divan didn't just fail to capture the market, it flopped on almost every level. The combination of a three-wheeled, unstable design with poor engineering, no real demand, and a shady businessman behind the wheel made it a legendary failure in automotive history. Despite all that, it still holds a strange place in the annals of car history, not for being a brilliant innovation or even a beloved classic, but for being a cautionary tale of how ambition, when paired with incompetence, can lead to disaster. Today, the Davis Divan stands as one of the ultimate symbols of failed ambition in the automotive world. It never had the chance to become a staple of the road. And as Jay Leno points out, it's really more of a bizarre footnote in the history of cars than anything else. Still, there's something oddly charming about the car's sheer absurdity. Perhaps in another world, where three-wheeled cars were the norm, the Davis Divan could have been a hit. But in the real world, it's a reminder that some cars, no matter how well-intentioned, are better off staying in the past. The 1975 AMC Pacer stands as one of the most peculiar and memorable cars in automotive history, a symbol of ambition gone awry. American Motors Corporation, AMC, always eager to carve out a unique identity amidst the titans of the American auto industry, aimed to reinvent the compact car. They set their sights on what they believed was the future of motoring, an unconventional, space-efficient vehicle that would blend futuristic design with practicality. But the result was a car that, while brimming with intention, came off as a strange, awkward misstep, a rolling fishbowl with aspirations of grandeur. From the outset, the Pacer's design was meant to be its defining feature. AMC aimed to create a vehicle that looked radically different from anything on the road. They wanted a compact car with a sense of openness and visibility, so they gave it large, expansive windows. Practically the entire cabin was made of glass. The intent was to create a fishbowl effect, offering panoramic visibility and a sense of space rarely found in a compact car. But while the concept of a bright, airy interior was innovative, it led to an unfortunate result. The car's proportions were so out of sync with conventional expectations that it seemed comically bulbous. The Pacer was wide but short, with exaggerated curves and a disproportionately high roofline. The end result looked like something you'd expect to find in a cartoon rather than a car lot. The glass was so large and dominant that it made the car appear bloated, as if it was trying too hard to stand out without realizing that it was trying too hard. The most perplexing thing about the Pacer's design was its awkwardness. It wasn't quite compact enough to be considered a true subcompact, nor was it large enough to be a proper family sedan. The exaggerated width made it look bloated, even though it wasn't technically a large car. While the wide stance might have made it feel more spacious inside, it created a visual disconnect between what the car seemed to be and what it actually was. Even the car's front end, with a small grille and boxy headlights, didn't fit the quirky design language. The tiny front wheel well, combined with the overly large windows and flat roofline, made the Pacer look clunky and off-balance. It felt like a concept that was never fully realized, a design idea that didn't quite translate well into a production model. On the inside, the Pacer was both quirky and underwhelming. The large glass areas allowed for a commanding view of the road, but the interior itself wasn't much to write home about. While it boasted ample headroom and decent interior space for its size, the rest of the cabin felt rather basic. The seats were cushy but not particularly comfortable, and the dashboard was utilitarian at best. It was clear that AMC had prioritized space and visibility, but they had sacrificed quality and refinement in the process. The Pacer's most significant failure, however, was its fuel economy. Despite being marketed as a compact economy car, the Pacer didn't live up to the expectations of being cheap to run. It had a reputation for consuming far more fuel than it should have. In fact, it was one of the worst offenders when it came to gas consumption, largely due to its bulky design and less than efficient engineering. Given that it was supposed to be a small car, it made little sense that it had the fuel efficiency of something much larger. The Pacer's poor fuel economy was particularly damaging during the energy crises of the 1970s, when Americans were looking for cars that could provide both efficiency and practicality. When it came to performance, the Pacer didn't fare much better. Despite its oddball looks, the car's ride quality was somewhat cushioned, but its handling was another story. The Pacer had a sluggish, ponderous feel behind the wheel. The car's handling didn't match its wild design. It was slow, underpowered, and cumbersome on the road. Drivers weren't able to enjoy the sense of agility that they might expect from a compact car, and the Pacer's sluggish nature made it feel almost like a large, heavy vehicle, despite its modest size. Perhaps the Pacer's biggest failure, though, was its inability to attract buyers. AMC positioned the car as a futuristic, unique alternative to the more conventional offerings from the big three automakers. But the market didn't buy into it. The Pacer's bizarre looks and unrefined performance didn't resonate with buyers, and it struggled to find a solid consumer base. Its awkward size and oddball features made it hard to categorize, which only made it more difficult to market. The Pacer wasn't quite a subcompact, but it wasn't large enough to be considered a family car either. As a result, it found itself stranded in a no-man's land, unable to define its own place in the market. In retrospect, the Pacer's failure was a key moment in AMC's decline. The 1967 Gyro-X is one of those ideas that perfectly encapsulates the thrill and pitfalls of ambitious automotive engineering. Born from the dream of a car that could balance on two wheels, it was essentially the automotive equivalent of balancing on a high wire. The Gyro-X promised to revolutionize transportation by utilizing a self-stabilizing gyro mechanism, an attempt to bring futuristic motorcycle-like maneuverability to a car. The concept was thrilling, a two-wheeled vehicle that could balance itself, speeding down the road with ease, offering something like the agility of a motorcycle, but the safety and comfort of a car. It was futuristic, innovative, and for a brief moment, it seemed like something straight out of science fiction, but that's where the dream unraveled. The most obvious flaw of the Gyro-X was its reliance on the gyro system to maintain balance. In theory, it worked wonderfully. Thanks to the spinning gyroscope inside the vehicle, it could stay upright, similar to how a top or a bicycle stays balanced when in motion. The system allowed the car to lean into turns like a motorcycle, which seemed promising. However, the practicality of relying on such a sophisticated and delicate mechanism for everyday use was questionable. Gyroscopes are complex, and keeping one in perfect working order in a high-speed, unpredictable environment like a car was a significant challenge. The mechanism was simply too prone to failure for comfort. If the gyro system malfunctioned, the car could fall over. Imagine driving down a highway at high speeds and having your vehicle unexpectedly tip over due to a mechanical failure. That's the kind of instability no car owner wants to experience. But it wasn't just the mechanical failure that made the Gyro-X a disaster. It was also the sheer impracticality of the design. It had only two wheels, which limited its ability to perform basic driving functions. The driver had to constantly balance the car, maintaining a delicate equilibrium at all times. For comparison, driving a two-wheeled vehicle like a motorcycle requires a constant focus on balance, and even experienced motorcyclists have to contend with challenging conditions like wind, rain, or debris. But a car is supposed to be stable and reliable, not something you have to constantly control just to keep it from tipping over. Even simple things like turning could become exhausting and unpredictable, with the car leaning heavily in one direction, trying to compensate for its instability. The Gyro-X also presented problems when it came to maneuvering and turning. Turning in a vehicle that balances on two wheels would naturally require more finesse than a traditional four-wheeled vehicle. The dynamics of leaning into a turn were an entirely new experience, making the car feel like a motorcycle that could tip at any moment if the balance was slightly off. This added a level of stress and fatigue that drivers weren't accustomed to, and it certainly didn't create the kind of pleasurable driving experience that people expect from a car. There were no backup systems in place. If the gyro mechanism failed, the car was at the mercy of gravity, ready to tip over. From a practicality standpoint, it also had a number of issues. The Gyro-X had no side windows, which made it impractical for everyday driving and, frankly, unsafe. Imagine trying to navigate through traffic without being able to easily glance to the side for a clear view of other vehicles. Its minimalistic design and lack of comfort features, no seats, no storage space, made it unsuitable as a daily driver, let alone as a reliable alternative to traditional vehicles. Despite the car's technological ambition, only one Gyro-X prototype was ever produced. The reality of the concept was simply too flawed to make it viable in real-world conditions. While the Gyro-X may have looked impressive in theory, its untested engineering and impractical design ensured that it was doomed to failure. The idea of a self-balancing car was incredibly forward-thinking, but without the reliability and functionality necessary for everyday use, it became just another failed dream of automotive innovation. Jay Leno, one of the most well-known car enthusiasts and collectors, has featured the Gyro-X on his show. He's noted its intrigue as a concept, but also openly admits how ridiculous the idea was in practice. Leno's take on the Gyro-X reflects the general automotive community's thoughts on the car. It's fascinating, it's a curiosity, but it's not something anyone would realistically want to drive. The Gyro-X stands as a testament to the limits of automotive innovation when the fundamental principles of safety and practicality are overlooked in favor of futuristic concepts. It wasn't just impractical, it was downright dangerous. But in its failure, the Gyro-X also helped remind engineers and designers of the importance of testing and refining ideas before they're put into production. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham is often cited as the epitome of 1950s automotive excess, a car so outlandishly opulent that it transcends luxury and enters the realm of absurdity. It's the kind of vehicle that had it all: chrome, fins, tailpipes, and so much flair that you couldn't help but feel like you were driving a piece of art, albeit one that might have been created in a fever dream. The tail fins are perhaps the most iconic and ridiculous feature of this car. They're so tall and exaggerated that they seem to belong on an airplane, not a car. Cadillac, in its prime, went all in on tail fins, but the 1959 model took it to an almost comical extreme. You can imagine how much attention this car detracted on the road. Its massive, razor-sharp fins alone could have been a danger in tight spaces. In fact, the fins were so large that they started to stray into the territory of absurdity, and they are the visual hallmark of automotive excess from the era. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement, as though the designers were saying, "We're Cadillac, and we are going to make the biggest, baddest thing on the road." And they certainly did. Then there's the grille. If the tail fins are what define the rear of the car, the front grille is its monstrous, gleaming face. It's a grille so large, so boldly detailed, it could intimidate lesser cars on the road just by virtue of its size. The chrome was polished to perfection, glinting in the sunlight, making the car look like a rolling mirror. The sheer size of the grille makes it seem as if the car was trying to suck up the entire road in front of it, and you get the sense that the 1959 Eldorado Brougham was less about performance and more about making the car feel like an immovable object, something you could literally cruise in and feel untouchable. Inside, the excess continued. The Brougham had leather seats, real wood paneling, and every feature Cadillac could think of. It was a car meant to spoil its driver and passengers, offering comfort and indulgence in equal measure. Power windows, power seats, air conditioning, it had all the luxuries that a king might desire. But even within this interior opulence, there was an element of over-the-top excess that couldn't be ignored. The padded dashboard was like something straight out of a luxury lounge, but it wasn't exactly practical or refined. It was just there to reinforce the notion that Cadillac was determined to make the most extravagant car of its time. While the sheer luxury and excess of the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham might have been impressive when it was new, it now comes across as almost cartoonish. It's as if the designers had a competition to see who could make the most extravagant car, and the Eldorado Brougham won by a landslide. This was an era when bigger was always better, but in hindsight, it's hard to not chuckle at how far Cadillac pushed the envelope. Jay Leno, who has a significant collection of classic cars, owns a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham, and while he's an admirer of its place in automotive history, even he can't deny that the car represents the peak of automotive excess. Leno himself has described the car as peak automotive excess, acknowledging that this was the point where Cadillac, in all its glory, pushed the limits of what was considered too much. It was a car that reveled in the philosophy that more was always more, and it worked, at least for those with the means to afford it. In a way, the Eldorado Brougham stands as a testament to a time when cars weren't just about getting from point A to point B. They were about creating a statement, an experience. With its excesses and its dramatic flair, the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham embodied everything Cadillac hoped to achieve: dominance on the road, a display of wealth, and a symbol of automotive grandeur. It was the car equivalent of wearing a crown, a little over the top, a bit ostentatious, but undeniably memorable. However, that doesn't mean it was entirely practical or even desirable in today's terms. The size, the weight, the impracticality of those giant fins, and the sheer cost made it a vehicle for a very specific kind of buyer. Yet, in its time, it was the pinnacle of automotive luxury, and even now it's a car that turns heads. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham is a perfect example of a vehicle that, despite its ridiculousness, has earned a place in history as one of the most iconic, if not absurd, cars ever built. The 1950 Crosley Hot Shot, often overlooked in the annals of automotive history, is a fascinating case study of ambition gone awry. Crosley, an American brand known more for its compact and affordable cars than for anything remotely resembling a true sports car, tried to make a splash in the sports car market by introducing the Hot Shot. Unfortunately, they took a rather misguided approach, and the result was a car that, while charming in its own way, was doomed from the start. The most glaring issue with the Hot Shot was, of course, its engine, or more accurately, its lack of engine. This diminutive car was powered by a tiny 26-horsepower engine, a power output so low that it barely managed to move the car along at any meaningful pace. In comparison, many modern lawnmowers boast more power than this little car, and that's saying something. Imagine stepping into what is supposed to be a sports car, an icon of speed, agility, and excitement, and realizing that it takes all of the car's 26 horses just to get it moving at a snail's pace. A sports car with the performance of a tricycle is, to say the least, a bit of a letdown. For Jay Leno, a man who loves quirky, offbeat cars, the Hot Shot was a rare example of a car that failed to even offer a modicum of fun on the road. His sentiment echoes a common refrain. While he respects Crosley's intentions, he can't help but acknowledge that the Hot Shot's lack of power and spirit made it more of a curiosity than a true sports car. The issue with the engine wasn't the only thing that set the Hot Shot back. As with many cars that were intended to be affordable or entry-level, the build quality left much to be desired. In the case of the Crosley Hot Shot, early models were plagued by a fatal flaw, rust. Specifically, the car's body was prone to rusting from the inside out, a situation that only worsened over time. The very thing that should have been the car's foundation, the body, was instead one of its biggest weaknesses. Imagine paying money for a new car, only to find that within a few years it's being slowly eaten away by corrosion. It was a major blow to the Hot Shot's longevity, and yet another nail in the coffin of its ill-fated existence. While most sports cars of its era were designed with an eye toward durability and performance, the Hot Shot's fragile, rust-prone construction was an afterthought. Cars like the Corvette and Jaguar XK140 were built to endure, to last. The Crosley Hot Shot, on the other hand, seemed to be made out of cheap tin that wouldn't last long enough to see its first oil change. But perhaps the most amusing aspect of the Hot Shot was its lightness, which on paper could have been a virtue. At only 300 pounds, it was light enough to float around corners like a feather in the wind. However, this lightness came at a cost. The Hot Shot's lack of stability made it dangerously susceptible to wind gusts. Yes, you read that correctly. If you drove this car on a particularly breezy day, you might just find yourself fighting to keep the car from being blown off the road. With a design so thin and lightweight, the Hot Shot was more of a sailboat than an actual car. It was the kind of vehicle that had no place in real-world driving conditions. A small gust of wind could knock it off course, and with no weight to anchor it to the road, the car felt as though it were a fragile toy that could be blown away at any moment. This was supposed to be a sports car, a car that would go fast and corner with confidence, but instead, it handled more like a kite than a vehicle meant for real driving. The Hot Shot, despite its name, was never going to set any hearts racing. It was a car that couldn't even get out of its own way, with a powertrain that would struggle to keep up with traffic. It was a car that couldn't withstand the elements or the rigors of everyday driving, with a body that would rust away before you had the chance to put on 50,000 miles. And yet, despite all of its shortcomings, the Hot Shot still managed to find a niche of enthusiasts. It wasn't fast, it wasn't particularly well built, and it wasn't even practical, but it was small, cute, and affordable. For some people, that was enough. It represented the dream of owning a little piece of automotive history, of driving a tiny car with the look and feel of a sports car, even if it was far from it in performance. The Crosley Hot Shot's failure to live up to its potential is a lesson in what happens when ambition, cost-cutting, and poor engineering collide. It was a car that tried to be something it couldn't be, a sports car for the masses. And while Jay Leno may appreciate the Hot Shot's oddball charm, he isn't shy about admitting that it simply wasn't fun to drive. It's a prime example of why a car needs more than just a cute design or a small price tag to be considered truly successful. Performance, durability, and build quality, these things matter. And in the case of the Crosley Hot Shot, the 1973 Reliant Robin is perhaps one of the most iconic examples of automotive misfortune, an infamous three-wheeled car that, instead of revolutionizing the automotive world, became a symbol of its own shortcomings. Originally conceived as an affordable and practical mode of transportation, the Robin quickly became one of the most laughed-at cars in history, not because of its price tag, but due to its downright dangerous design and comically poor handling. For starters, the Reliant Robin only had 3 wheels. While this may have seemed like an innovative approach to reduce manufacturing costs and simplify design, the result was nothing short of catastrophic in terms of stability. With no 4th wheel to balance the weight, the Robin was incredibly prone to tipping over, particularly during sharp turns, high-speed maneuvers, or when hitting even the smallest bump in the road. The car was so unstable that it was more of a novelty than a practical vehicle. In fact, many people who owned a Robin quickly learned that driving it on anything but perfectly flat ground could lead to a catastrophic and often embarrassing tip-over. As the car gained notoriety for its propensity to fall over, it became a national joke, especially in the UK. Even the show Top Gear, a British car program known for its wild antics, took advantage of the car's unstable nature. Over the years, the show gained a reputation for purposefully tipping over Reliant Robins as part of their humor segments. With their utterly poor design and bizarre 3-wheeled structure, the cars became easy targets for pranks, humiliating and adding to their already laughable status. To this day, the Reliant Robin is considered one of the most meme-worthy cars ever, with countless online videos showing the car falling over, usually for comedic effect. And that's not the end of its problems. The car's design was never going to win any beauty contests either. In fact, it looked like a toy car with a bloated, awkward body. The small size and strange proportions made it hard to take seriously, and its appearance only added to its reputation as a joke. The Reliant Robin was so unremarkable in terms of looks that, at times, it seemed as though its creators had set out to design a car that was purposefully unattractive just for the sake of it. The combination of the odd proportions, strange rear end, and awkward wheel configuration made it hard to ignore, but for all the wrong reasons. Its mechanical failures were as common as its ill-fated tip-overs. Powered by a feeble engine with little horsepower, it struggled to even get up to speed. Many owners of the Reliant Robin were frustrated by how slow it was, with performance levels that bordered on non-existent. The small engine, paired with its minimal weight, would have been a minor issue if the car had actually been able to handle decently. But when combined with the unpredictable and chaotic steering, the Robin's slow acceleration was simply one more strike against it. And that's where Jay Leno's take on the Robin fits perfectly. Leno, who has had the privilege of driving some of the most iconic and bizarre cars on the planet, often includes the Reliant Robin in his long list of automotive oddities. He famously compared driving one to sitting in a washing machine on spin cycle, referring to its unpredictable and disorienting handling. The simple act of driving the Robin quickly became a nerve-wracking experience. With its small size and unusual structure, it felt like the car was constantly on the edge of disaster, its 3 wheels teetering on the verge of flipping over with every maneuver. No amount of cautious driving would guarantee stability, and even simple actions like turning or accelerating could result in the vehicle becoming a rolling hazard. Despite all its flaws, the Reliant Robin did manage to carve out a niche in certain markets. It was cheap, it was compact, and it was simple. It found its way into the hands of people who just needed something to get from point A to point B, with little concern for style or speed. In theory, it might have made sense as an inexpensive urban car for short-distance driving. But in practice, it was anything but that. The car was an unreliable disaster, and its reputation as a death trap continued to follow it through the years. At the end of the day, the Reliant Robin stands as an example of how poor engineering, bad design, and the failure to account for basic stability can lead to automotive infamy. It is a textbook case of a car that just wasn't ready for the road, and yet it remains one of the most memorable failures in car history. It's impossible to think about the Reliant Robin without imagining it tipping over or hearing the jokes that have followed it for decades. The car may have been well-intentioned, but its unfortunate design doomed it from the start, leaving it to be remembered as one of the most ridiculous and most beloved cars ever built. The 1974 Bricklin SV-1 is one of those cars that makes you scratch your head and wonder how something with such high ambitions ended up so far from success. Born out of Canada's attempt to enter the muscle car market, the Bricklin was supposed to be a sleek, high-performance sports car with a unique twist: gull-wing doors. But instead of being a futuristic marvel, it became a cautionary tale about how good ideas can quickly go off the rails if they're not executed properly. For starters, the car had a lot going for it on paper. The gull-wing doors, while a bit gimmicky, were at least original, offering an intriguing way to enter the car. Unfortunately, the hydraulic mechanisms that powered these doors were prone to failure, often leaving owners in an uncomfortable and frustrating situation. If the hydraulics didn't work properly, which they often didn't, you were either stuck inside or unable to close the doors, making a dramatic exit, if you could even get out, impossible. It was as if the car was taunting you. I look cool, but you can't even use my main feature without a struggle. But it didn't stop at the doors. The Bricklin was heavy, much heavier than its competitors, and this significantly impacted its performance. Despite the fact that it was trying to compete in the muscle car market, the SV-1 was sluggish and underwhelming when it came to speed. With its hefty fiberglass body and a 5.8-liter V8 engine that wasn't quite enough to counteract the weight, the Bricklin wasn't setting any records for acceleration or handling. It could barely manage a 0-60 time that would have made a modern minivan look quick. What you ended up with was a car that looked like it wanted to be fast but simply couldn't deliver. Reliability was another major issue. The Bricklin wasn't just slow. It was prone to breaking down, and it wasn't just small, fixable issues that plagued the car. The entire design seemed to be at odds with what a high-performance vehicle should be. Whether it was electrical problems, issues with the unique fiberglass body, or the stubborn hydraulics for the gull-wing doors, the SV-1 was an unreliable mess. The car's build quality was far from stellar, and owners found themselves constantly in and out of the mechanic's shop. The car's aesthetic wasn't exactly helping its case either. While some might argue the Bricklin had a striking look, futuristic, angular, with its unique gull-wing doors, its proportions and design were simply off. It looked like a car that had been designed by committee, with an awkward balance between an aggressive muscle car and something more exotic. The wide stance and sharp angles didn't scream performance or elegance, they just looked forced. Jay Leno, who has driven and featured his fair share of quirky and strange cars, took the Bricklin for a spin on his show and summed it up pretty succinctly: a well-intentioned disaster. He appreciated the effort and the vision behind the car, but couldn't ignore how badly it missed the mark in almost every other area. Leno also pointed out that while it wasn't the worst thing he had ever driven, the Bricklin was emblematic of a time when a good idea didn't always translate into a good product. Despite its shortcomings, the Bricklin SV-1 does hold a certain place in automotive history. There were only about 2,800 built, and its status as a rare, quirky vehicle with a cult following has kept it alive in the minds of car enthusiasts and collectors. But its status as a muscle car is more of a punchline than a proud legacy. In the end, the Bricklin SV-1 serves as a reminder that even the most ambitious projects can fall apart if the execution doesn't match the vision. It wasn't a terrible car because of its lack of ideas. It was a terrible car because those ideas weren't fully realized. Whether it was the gull-wing doors that didn't work, the sluggish performance, or the overall reliability issues. The Bricklin was a car that had potential, but fell far short of what it could have been. A well-intentioned disaster, as Leno put it, one that could have been a shining example of Canadian engineering, but instead became a lesson in how even the most well-meaning concepts can crash and burn. The 1951 Hoffman three-wheeler remains one of the most baffling, bizarre, and borderline ludicrous vehicles ever conceived in the automotive world. When you first look at it, the Hoffman may seem like a quirky oddity, a product of a whimsical idea gone awry. But the truth is far worse. It's a cautionary tale of poor engineering and misguided ambition that somehow managed to make it into production. The car, to put it bluntly, was a disaster in motion. While the Hoffman three-wheeler is certainly a rare piece of automotive history, it is far from being a desirable or functional piece of machinery. The design choices made in the creation of the Hoffman three-wheeler read like a checklist of mistakes that would ensure the vehicle's failure from the start. One of the most glaring problems was its rear-wheel steering system. Now, rear-wheel steering can work on certain vehicles, under certain conditions, but this was not one of them. The idea behind rear-wheel steering was to make the car more nimble, but in the Hoffman, it did the opposite. The steering system was notoriously difficult to control, creating a chaotic driving experience that left drivers feeling like they were steering a runaway shopping cart rather than a vehicle. It didn't help that the rear wheels were not aligned properly for precision handling, leading to unpredictable, unstable driving dynamics that made it all but impossible to keep the car on course. Now let's talk about the shifting system. Instead of a simple gear lever within reach, the Hoffman required drivers to physically reach behind the seat to change gears. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The act of reaching behind your seat to shift gears took your attention away from the road, making the vehicle even harder to handle. Not only was it an impractical design choice, but it made a challenging driving experience even more hazardous. The car's design seemed to have no regard for ergonomics or driver safety, further compounding its impracticality. To make matters worse, this absurdly designed shifting mechanism was paired with a car that wasn't exactly designed for easy operation. Its three-wheel design was a ticking time bomb for instability. With only 3 wheels, 1 in front and 2 in the rear, the Hoffman three-wheeler lacked any semblance of balance. Unlike a traditional 4-wheeled vehicle, the Hoffman couldn't rely on its extra wheel for added stability, and so cornering and maneuvering were a dicey affair. The vehicle felt like it was constantly teetering on the edge of tipping over, making even the most basic turns feel like an adventure in risk management. The entire experience of driving the Hoffman was disorienting, as though the car was always on the verge of breaking down or losing control. Beyond the horrific engineering flaws, the Hoffman three-wheeler's design was, to put it mildly, visually perplexing. Its shape resembled a toy rather than a serious automobile, with its overly simplistic form and awkward proportions. The exterior had all the grace of a plastic model glued together by someone with no regard for proportion or aesthetics. It wasn't cute, it wasn't quirky, it was a sad exercise in failed automotive design. In its three-wheeled form, it presented itself as a car, but it didn't really seem like one. It lacked the purposeful design of other vehicles, resulting in a car that seemed out of place, unfinished, and fundamentally unpractical. The Hoffman three-wheeler was, in every sense of the word, a car built for failure. There's no question that the company behind it had grand ambitions for a vehicle that was small, efficient, and different from the norm, but the execution was horrendous. No one wanted a car that was impractical to drive, unsafe to operate, and downright uncomfortable. And despite the ambitious, albeit flawed, attempt at innovation, only one Hoffman three-wheeler was ever built. Thankfully so. Jay Leno, known for his collection of quirky and eccentric cars, featured the Hoffman three-wheeler on his show. His verdict was clear: the worst car ever made. Leno, who's had his fair share of oddball cars, didn't hold back in his criticism, underscoring just how ridiculous the Hoffman was in comparison to other vehicles of its time, or any time for that matter. His scathing remarks encapsulated the general sentiment surrounding the car. The Hoffman three-wheeler was a joke, a car that never should have been made, yet somehow found its way into history. It wasn't innovative or revolutionary, It was simply a mechanical mess wrapped in an even worse design. The Hoffman three-wheeler is the perfect example of how not to approach vehicle development. It represents a car that was born out of flawed ideas, with poor execution and no regard for practicality, usability, or safety. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes not every idea needs to be pursued, especially if it leads to something that doesn't work, doesn't drive well, and most importantly,